So I've had the privilege for the past 30 days to play Warhammer Online, and it is absolutely brutal in 2025. Warhammer Online, or Age of Reckoning, or Return to Reckoning, it has a bunch of different names. However, after the main game shut down, a fan service project was created so that this game would live on, and it has lived on for over 10 years. And while the game is a bit older and a bit clunky at times, it really delivers for the Warhammer MMO that everyone would want. So let me go ahead and talk about the things that it does right, as well as things that it could improve upon, and whether or not it's worth your time in 2025. So first and foremost, one of the biggest, best things about this game, and there's no other way to put it, is the PvP. This game is centered around player versus player, the conflict between order and destruction. Now, if you know anything about the Warhammer universe, it is embroiled in combat and fighting and death and all the glorious things that come with war. And this game is absolutely no different. The main focus of this game is broken really down into two separate entities. And honestly, I would even lower that down to one. The main focus of this game is the player versus player in realm versus realm, or RVR, or in scenarios or skirmishes, however you wish to call that, which are structured battleground like player versus player interactions. The Realm v Realm, which I will focus on mainly, is incredible. It feels very much like massive open world sieges where you and hundreds of allies are doing their very best to push back the enemies and capture a specific point, destroy their keep, and claim victory over this area. Now, given that this game is centered around PvP, it really does do the castle siege as well as the large warband style of feeling really, really well. Many times during my play, I found myself really enjoying just roaming around with a large group of allies and claiming what areas that we could and working down the front door of the enemy just so that we could progress the map. And while yes, PvP is technically optional in this regard, it is probably one of the most important things to do in said game because it is the best way to get gear and improve your character in Warhammer Online. So aside from your experience bar, you have what's called the renown bar. So your renown levels as you do more player versus player interactions, skirmishes, or open world realm versus realm combat. Now, what's really important about this is that you can nearly scale. I've heard that you can scale it all the way up to like 250 or 60 or something. It has such a high exponential curve. But for the most part, players work all the way up until about level 80 renown, where they can get the best gear that is available. I think anything after that is superfluous. And while going out in this Realm v Realm area and doing all of the open world PvP, it really does stack on the renown fairly fast. However, that really only attributes if your side is winning. I'll talk about this a little bit later as far as the population in these areas, but the player versus player really does feel like its most involved and important aspect of this game. And it's something that I would highly recommend you noting before getting into this game, is that is a very important part of it. But let's go ahead and talk about another thing that it does really well, and that is the lore. So the Warhammer Fantasy Battle lore, as well as even like 40k and Age of Sigmar, all the different variations, is immense. There is whole chronicles and books and massive YouTube channels that are just focused on explaining what the lore is. And Warhammer Online is nothing to snuff at. They really do a great job of packing this game full of history and lore and understanding of why we are in combat, who we are combating, and why it's important that we are fighting. Take, for example, the most recent path that I did, which was Dark Elves versus High Elves. The Dark Elves, or the Drugi, are mortal enemies of their cousins, the High Elves, who, if you follow into the history, basically Malekith, who was the son of Anarion, was supposed to be the leader of the High Elves, but they turned him down because they needed someone with softer hands. And eventually he got tired of their crap and became the Dark Elves after listening to his mom, Marathi, who was also the consort of Anarion. Anyway, the idea is that each one of the races that are included in this game have such in-depth lore, and then they tack in the locations of all of the lore in such an amazing and immersive way. And granted, this really only covers the High Elves, this only really covers the Empire, the Dwarves, the Dark Elves, the Greenskins, and then Chaos. It really doesn't even talk about, say, like the Lizardmen. It doesn't talk about the undead pirates or just even the undead vampire lords. I mean, there's so much more that could have been added to this, but in this, we'll say, offshoot of the lore, the forces of order and the forces of chaos have joined together to combat each other. So forces of order has high elves, empire, and dwarves, while destruction has chaos, it has greenskins, and it has the dark elves. And the idea is that the lore is built off of this, but not in a way that it is completely uprooting the main features, the heart of what Warhammer Online is about. And I feel like that is something that should not be understated. This game does such an amazing job of keeping true to the lore and creating the atmosphere that really makes this game pop, in my opinion. But not as much as the class diversity. Holy crap, I love the class diversity. So each one of the races has essentially 4, we'll say, class archetypes that it can complete. So each race has a tank, it has a healer, it has a ranged DPS, as well as a melee DPS. Now, what each class has the capability of doing varies a lot, honestly, depending on who you are approaching. So say, for example, the Dark Elf, I played the Blackguard, which is the Dark Elf tank, in contrast to the High Elf Swordmaster, which is their tank. The idea is that there is this juxtapose of almost equal, we'll say, footing and boundary given each one of the classes that are included. So again, the Dark Elves to the High Elves, as well as the Greenskins to the Dwarves, and then the Empire to Chaos. The Witch Elves, which are the Dark Elves melee unit, is comparable to the Empire's Witch Hunter, or say, for example, the Greenskins Squig Herder, which is the range archer type, is counter to the Shadow Warrior for the High Elves. These balance each other out in such a great way that it is a lot of fun to see the depth and see just the subtle differences. Now, I didn't get to play all of the different classes, but I'd imagine very similarly that, the High Elf Swordmaster would play very similar to the Dark Elf Blackguard, or the Witch Elf would play very similar to the Witch Hunter, which I have had experience playing. But the classes are so diverse and there's such a widespread of what each one of these guys can do that it's a lot of fun to just poke and play and just go about your business. I really, really love the class diversity here in this game, and it is something that it shouldn't be overlooked. Now let's go ahead and talk about some of the negatives of the game, which of course, with the game being this old and it basically being a reclamation of what the game used to be, there are some. So the first thing that I would talk about, which is always on the cusp of every MMO player's mind, is the population. How does the population fare? Overall, by standard MMO practices, it has low population. We're only talking about anywhere between like 700 to 1,000 players at any given time on a single server. Granted, this does cause an issue. This does cause a problem for some people who want to have that massive immersive kind of playstyle where there's tons of MMO players running all around. And in my experience, even going out into the open world and questing, finding other players were few and far between. The Realm v Realm and the scenarios were fairly populated. I always found people there. However, a good majority of the time that I spent in this game was out in the open world questing and doing all that, so I didn't necessarily run into that many people. Given that it's a remake and it's an older remake of what the game used to be, the population is fairly small. I will, however, note that they do make a very big point that they are looking to progress the game, offer more player versus environment factors. They recently added Dragonback Pass, which is a brand new low-level dungeon that you can get into at level 10 or something, or even earlier, I'd imagine. However, there is a growing amount of content that is included into this game for the small team of devs, and unfortunately, the population is low if we compare to, say, World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy or any of the other mainstream titles. Another thing that will probably offset some people is the older graphics. Let's be serious, it is a remake of a game that was created in the late 2000s, so it's not going to have the pristine graphics that everyone likes to see. However, the graphics do serve their purpose and they are relatively clear. I will give the idea of the UI and its ability to be customized is actually really, really a fantastic touch, because then you can really set up the game how you wish to be. However, they do also have mods, which are community created add-ons that you can put into the game, which can adjust things back and forth. I did see those. I didn't experience them. I didn't put them onto my game, but that is something that you can do. I know quite a few MMO players, and even in my other videos, players have made a very big point to say, well, the graphics suck. I can't play a game that looks ugly. And it's like, well, yeah, you can. Your standards may just be a little bit higher than what this game has to offer. And that's fine. It's not going to be for everyone, but going into this game knowing that the older graphics are there. And lastly, the biggest con that I found in this game is that the combat and the movement can be incredibly clunky. And I mean the best regards that you can say for an older MMO. At times, there was this kind of like body blocking as you were trying to move through a large crowd of enemies, and that could happen. You could move through a large crowd of enemies or allies and get completely body blocked and not be able to move. That was something that I found to be a nuisance. And then the combat, while not necessarily, we'll say, super fast-paced, it had a layer of complexity, which was great, but there was nothing that really stood out to me that made it like, oh, wow, that's really, really cool. Like, for example, my Blackguard basically just used his sword and his glaive, and that was about it. And there was really no other changes that were needed. It's just single strikes, and bam, there it is. This ability that I'm using for like Hateful Strike, you know, does the same exact attack animation almost as, you know, like Pitiless Strike. There really wasn't too much diversity. And between that and the movements, at sometimes it felt tedious and kind of obnoxious. I'll be quite frank with you. However, if that's all I can say negatively about the game, then I think we're in a pretty good spot, because let's go ahead and talk about if it's worth playing in 2025. So in short, absolutely, this game is 100% worth playing in 2025, at least just to understand what the game is about. Now, I recently went through and played all the way to max level. I think I put about like 40 or 50 hours into the game and had a great time. But I will also say that I understand the experience now, and I have learned a lot during that time. I don't know necessarily if I want to jump back in and level up a different race or class or anything like that, but it was an enjoyable experience playing the game, seeing what it's about, and just getting immersed into the lore. I played Total War Warhammer 2 for nearly like 400 hours or something, and I loved that game, and I love the lore behind it and all the different classes, and to see that alive in this game was actually a lot of fun. Like Avalorn, okay, running into the damn handmaidens of Alariel, that was really cool. Getting all the way to Illyrian and running into the Illyrian Reavers, like those kind of things were cool. I think at one point I ran into Marathi, who is Malekith's mom. There's a lot to take with this game of why it is so good. So I would say that the game is 100% worth playing, even if you just are casually interested. There's no cost, there's no fee to pay, there's never any buy to win, nothing like that. And it is such a fan service that the game is worth your time in 2025. If you want to see more of the CDG Plays content, you can click this video here. Otherwise, stay caffeinated, folks.